downstairs and I called the fire department. When I came upstairs again, it was to see that our whole house was encircled by flames 25 meters high, 5 stories high. It was the worst fire in Californian history at the time. It had broken out just up the road from us, and I was caught in the middle of it for 3 hours. I grabbed my mother's cat, we ran outside and jumped into a car to try to escape, and we drove down our narrow driveway. And when we came to the mountain road, we saw we couldn't go up, we couldn't go down. The smoke was so thick that we could hear helicopters above, but they couldn't see us and we couldn't see them. And the fire was so intense that no fire truck could get up to us. The only thing that saved us was a good Samaritan who had been driving along the highway. He'd seen a fire break out in the hills, and because he had a water truck, he drove up to be of help and somehow ended up stranded by chance right next to our driveway. And so when we got there, there he was, shirtless, in his shorts, with a hose. And every time the flames approached from the north, he would poke the hose towards it and they would recede. Every time they would approach from the south, he would poke the hose in the other direction. And really, by saving his life, he saved ours. For 45 minutes on that road, we were actually right under our family home. And so I could see the flames systematically making their way through our living room, and then going downstairs and reducing every last childhood toy and memento to ash, and then moving on to my office and wiping out really my next 8 years of writing, my next 3 books which were in handwritten notes, and in some ways I think demolishing many of my boyhood dreams of becoming a writer. When finally a fire truck was able to get up to us and tell us it was safe to drive downtown, I went to an all-night supermarket. I bought a toothbrush, and that toothbrush was the only thing I had to start a new life. And then I went to a friend's floor, or a friend's house, to sleep on the floor, and of course I was on that floor for many months to come as slowly my mother and I began to reconstruct our lives. And one day, another friend, who happened to be a local school teacher, came there, and he saw me on the floor, and he said, "Come on, Pico, you can do better than this." And he told me how every spring he would take his high school classes up to a quiet retreat house, 4 hours by car up the California coast. And according to him, even the most phone-addicted, distractible, fidgety Californian boy only had to spend 3 days in silence, and something in him cooled down and cleared out to the point where my friend said many of his students never wanted to return back to their normal lives. And so, of course, I thought anything that works for a 15-year-old Californian boy, probably ideal for me. And if nothing else, I would have a bed to sleep in, and a wide desk, and a private walled garden overlooking the Pacific Ocean. All the food I could eat, all for $30 a night. So I got into my car and I began driving up the coast. And many of you know that in Central California, Highway 1 becomes narrower and emptier till you're just in this vast elemental landscape with golden meadows running down from the mountains on one side and the great flat blue plate of the Pacific Ocean on the other. And then I came to an even narrower road that snaked and twisted for 2 miles up to the top of a hill where this retreat house stood. When I got out of my car, the silence was pulsing. It wasn't just an absence of the noise we were just hearing about. It was really a presence, maybe of everything I sleepwalk past in my regular life. And I went down to the small but comfortable room in which I would be sleeping, and just at that moment, a rabbit alighted on the splintered fence in my garden. And I just looked at that rabbit as if it were a miracle. I was absolutely present to that moment. Shortly thereafter, bells began tolling behind me, and I really felt that they were tolling inside of me. There was no division between inner and outer. And after night fell, I took a walk along the road under this great overturned salt shaker of stars, and I could see the tail lights of the cars disappearing around the headlands 12 miles to the south. And honestly, I can tell you I've never felt happier and clearer and calmer. Even though 3 hours earlier on the drive up, as usual, I was filled with agitations and debates. So of course I started going back to that place more and more often, for longer and longer. I'd stay there for 2 weeks, I'd stay there for 3 weeks. I'd even stay with the monks when all the 15 retreat rooms were filled. Because lo and behold, this place happened to be a Catholic hermitage. I'm not even a Christian, I'm not really a religious person, but the Benedictine monks were generous enough to open their hearts and their doors to everybody. And as the years went on and I started going more and more often, I noticed two curious things. The first is that our house where we'd been living and which we rebuilt in exactly the same property sits at exactly the same elevation as the monastery. It's 1,250 feet above the ocean, and it enjoys this glorious, radiant, unobstructed view of the sea beyond. And I think anybody looking at our house would say it's the last word in tranquility and remoteness. But of course, if ever I were tempted to look at a rabbit when I'm at home, I hear the phone ringing inside. If ever I wanted just to look at the light upon the sea, I think, no way, I have 100 emails I could be answering. And if ever I were tempted to take a walk under the stars, I would think, wait a minute, Alcaraz is playing Sinner tonight. No chance I should miss that. And so I talk myself out of my calm and then wonder why I'm so frazzled. The second thing that struck me was that to this day, and I've been there more than 100 times over 34 years, every time I go, there are 1,000 reasons not to go. I feel really guilty about leaving my aging mother behind, and I feel upset and worried my bosses can't reach me for 72 hours because there's no internet or cell phone reception there. I'm missing a friend's birthday party. But as soon as I arrive, I realize it's only by going there that I'll have anything calm and joyful and creative to share with my mother and my friends and my colleagues, because really otherwise all they're getting is my exhaustion, my distractedness, my call of catch you later. Now you're wondering at this point, why in the world is this guy talking about all this? What has it got to do with humanity's last frontier? But just as Mr. Sarkar was saying, my sense is that humanity's last frontier is really humanity's first frontier, which is what kind of invisible clarity and calm can we find to make our peace with artificial intelligence and all the technologies that are accelerating so quickly. And this is an idea of India, but it's also, I think, an idea from India, because you all know, for millennia, it's really India that has been telling the rest of the world how much we gain by clearing our heads, by sitting still, and by finding some reality behind the show of passing experiences. His Holiness the Dalai Lama always points out we can only make use of the most modern technologies by bringing to them the most ancient principles and values. So just this week, as it happens, by chance, I brought out a new book that in India is called Listening to Silence. And I think one reason, after 34 years, I wanted to bring it out now is we all know the world is accelerating at a furious pace. And my prejudice is that humans were never meant to live at a pace determined by machines. The only way we could do that is by becoming machines ourselves. And I don't think even my friends in Silicon Valley would wish for that. And I'm guessing that many of you know this problem whereby we're caught in a vicious cycle whereby we're in such a hurry, we can't see what a hurry we're in. And we have to do something quite dramatic and radical to cut through that self-perpetuating predicament. Now, I know that everybody in this room already does something to clear your head and to clear your schedule. I'm sure many of you have a yoga practice, or many of you practice meditation every day. Maybe some of you go for a run every day, or swim, or play the piano, or play tennis, or cook, or sail. But I think whatever it is we're doing, we need to do more. And even 100 years ago, J.P. Morgan was giving himself 2 months off every year and saying wonderfully that he could never achieve in 12 months what he achieved in 10. There is a reason why Steve Jobs told his colleagues never to use PowerPoint, and why he would take long walks whenever he was deliberating over some essential decision. There's a reason why Bill Gates, every few months, puts a whole set of books in a sack and goes to a little cabin in a deserted island to clear his head, to fill his head, and to prepare to come back in a much more directed way to the busy world. There's a reason that Warren Buffett keeps his calendar almost entirely clean and never follows the Bloomberg monitor. I think all of them know it's only by stepping away from the tumult of the world that you can begin to do justice to it and can begin to see the larger picture. Excuse me, the frog in the throat. I was in a plane all yesterday coming from Japan. But there's another reason why I brought this book out right now. And that is that I've never seen our world and so many of our nations as divided as they are right now. This may apply to India. You could tell me more about that than I know. But certainly in the United States, there's a sense that we're being cut up by essentially our words and our beliefs. I voted for that person, you voted for this one. I belong to this tradition, you belong to that one. I know I'm in the right, which means you must be in the wrong. And one reason why I stress silence is that it's available to everybody, it's non-denominational, and I think it sits on the far side of our ideologies and our ideas. If I were to engage any of you in conversation, at some point I think we would be at odds because our assumptions about the world don't coincide. But if all the 300 of us in this room were joined in a moment of silence, I think we would find ourselves united in some deep part of ourselves that lives far beneath our passing assumptions. There's also another reason why I brought out this book right now, and that's the fact that I've never seen my friends so despairing as they are currently, between climate change and wars and technologies racing out of control. And in the United States, this book is called Aflame, and I actually flew back last month into Southern California to talk about Aflame the very day that fires were so tragically rewriting so many lives in Los Angeles. And when I drove up to our rebuilt house on the hill, it was to see it pitch black, no phone service, as so often happens nowadays, all the power turned off because of high winds and the high possibility that we could be burnt down again. And so really for 4 days I was handling all my mail and my bills and my interviews just by the light of a little lantern. And my monk friends, because they live on 900 acres of remote wilderness in the hills of California, are constantly encircled by flames and running for their lives. And at one point, at the end of the pandemic, a terrible fire broke out just on the property next to theirs, and nearly all the monks raced off to evacuate, but 3 stayed behind to help the firefighters try to protect their home. And one of them was the prior, who was the center of that community. And quite often he would send out updates to anxious friends, such as myself, to tell us what was going on. And one day he said, "We can see smoke everywhere. There were pulsing lights wherever we look. Every now and then we see just a wall of orange rising up behind the ridge, 200 yards away from us. But don't worry, the bells call us to our offices, and we're maintaining our vigils, our matins, and our vespers just as we normally would. Blessed day all. Blessed day all, he said, on the very day when it looked as if he could very easily lose his life and lose everything that he loved and cared about. And of course, that kind of confidence comes from his faith. But I think it's a confidence all of us long for, whether we have a faith or not. It's the only thing we have to help us through this tumultuous world. The whole world is on fire, literally and metaphorically. Sometimes it may take the form of typhoons or hurricanes or tsunamis, but it's essentially the same thing. And I think everybody on our planet, as during the pandemic, is addressing two questions. As was said earlier, how do we stay calm in the midst of mounting uncertainty? And how do we remain hopeful in the face of impermanence? Now we get to the fun part. I'm so looking forward to talking to my revered old friend, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Pico, and indeed, I think the applause more than well merited. But I think Pico has also left us with some questions, and I think that's one of the things that I'm going to try and get out of him. The silence in the Benedictine monastery. Is this in any way reminiscent of the ancient practice of Vipassana that we hear about in India, where again it's meditation in silence, or is there something different about the Benedictine practice?
Very, very similar, I would say. And I think all the great traditions have different names and different definitions for coming to exactly the same place. It's as if there are many different paths to the top of the mountain. I think the main difference is that the place where I go to has no formal practice, no leaders, no rules, essentially. It's absolutely free. And so the monks leave every visitor on her own, so she can take a walk or read or do what's hardest of all, nothing at all. And they're confident that whoever you are, whatever your background or lack of background, you'll find what you need. So it's not a guided collective practice as Vipassana is. But living near Kyoto as I do, as you can imagine, for years I would see people returning from their Vipassana practice, 10-day retreats, and they were electric. They were walking on the clouds. And I could just see how elevated and clarified they had been by that. I just recently actually did a public event with a young person called Young Pueblo, Ecuadorian American, whose life was so transformed by Vipassana practice that he now goes on 45-day retreats. He's a professional meditator, and he has 3 million followers on Instagram, which shows that there's a universal longing. But I think the heart of this, which links Vipassana and meditation and the Benedictine monks that I go to, is the silence. And I know, Thomas Merton, the monk who lived so close to silence for 27 years, said there's more substance in silence than in the answer to any question. So actually, I trust my silences more than I trust my answers. And there was a wonderful Benedictine monk called Father Thomas Keating, who used to say something I think anyone in India would recognize: silence is God's language, and everything else is a pure translation, or poor translation.
There's a very similar thought in the Upanishads, but that silence is also meant in some ways to represent that which cannot be expressed, that just so ineffable it is beyond human comprehension and cannot be reduced to words. But no, I'm not going to let you off the hook. Have you ever tried Vipassana? Is that something that you were tempted by at any point? Have you experienced the difference between the one and the other?
I haven't experienced it. And I think I was tempted, but since I found this course, I've stayed with it. The Tibetans say much better to dig one ditch or one well that's 60 foot deep rather than 10 that are 6 foot deep each. So once I found this, I thought, let me go deeper into this rather than trying something else.
So what do you do when you're still? I mean, you mentioned there's no leader, no guide, no one telling you what to do. So how do you derive an organized benefit? If you're sitting there still and silent, now you probably have a far more disciplined mind than I do. I'm just curious, doesn't your mind want to wander off and take you to other places?
It does. I mean, as a fellow writer who's more prolific than I am, much of your life is spent in silence at the desk, yes? Following the trains of the mind and also seeing what's on the far side of the mind. I loved what you said about how the silence speaks for the inexpressible, which I think most of us trust more than anything human. That's, I think, the heart of our discomfort with AI. It's coming from a group of engineers, and the typhoons are coming from what the monks call acts of God. So they're going to defeat AI probably. So what I do there is allow myself a holiday and understand a holy day the way I never do. This may be true with you, because you're so full of energy. When I go on holiday, I map out an itinerary. 8 o'clock I'm here, 10 o'clock I'm there. So I never allow myself just to wander, or get lost, or do nothing. And this is the one place where I allow myself not to write. And when I wake up, I just follow intuition and the moment. I think, oh, I'll take a walk and see the sun rise up over the hill. Or I'll pick a book at random out of my suitcase. Or I'll just sit there. Just sit. And I never allow myself to do that, usually.
I see. So you can pick a book up, but you wouldn't be allowed to write, because the music of the words you're writing would probably interfere with your silence, wouldn't it?
Yes. Well, this is why it's such a liberal place. You are allowed to read, and you are allowed to talk. Not in the retreat house, but when you walk along the road, you're allowed to seek spiritual counsel from the monks, or just talk to a friend. So now I go there with my wife. And she and I stay in separate places, but we share meals together, talking quietly, and we share long walks at sunrise and sunset. And the big surprise for me, I think more than you, I love being by myself. I'm an only child. I spend my whole life at my desk. I'm not engaged in the real world the way you are. So when I got there, I thought, this is heaven. I can spend my whole day by myself. And as I started going there more often, I found actually the solitude is a gateway to community and compassion, because of course the monks are the opposite of solitary and silent. They're working around the clock to take care of one another and to take care of their visitors. They're cooking and raising vegetables and fixing the generator and taking care of accounts, and a very busy life, 24 hours a day for the rest of their lives. And when I stay with them, it's not heavenly at all. It's like being in an office in some ways. But when I walk along that road, if I meet a stranger and we exchange a couple of sentences, we can sense the silence from which those sentences come. In other words, the sentence I hear lives within me for a long time, as it wouldn't on the streets of Mumbai. And I can sense that the two sentences the stranger has exchanged are coming from the depths of her. And so the curious thing is that whoever I meet on that road, I trust, and I feel an instant kinship to. And sadly, that doesn't happen on the streets of New York City or even on the streets of Japan, because we're joined not by our jobs or where we happen to live or where we happen to go to college, but by the fact we've both been drawn to this silence and to whatever is inexpressible, as you said. So we're linked really by what's deepest in us and not just surface features or characteristics.
I am curious. I first discovered Pico as I would argue a travel writer. His first couple of books were about discovering other worlds. And then, if I look at his last half a dozen titles, I don't know if some of them are simply different editions of the same book, but you've got The Half-Known Life, you've got Aflame, Learning from Silence, you've got The Art of Stillness, Falling Off the Map, Abandon, The Man Within My Head. One can't get away from the thought that you are, in a sense, escaping from the world. Is that unfair?
I hope it's incomplete. It's not unfair. But I remember when I was a little boy, you might have had the same thought. I thought there are two things I need to do. One is to get to know the world. And both of us were born in the first generation when we could be in Tibet or Ethiopia or Bolivia tomorrow. And I wanted to make the most of that. And the second was, I need to get to know the self. As Mr. Sarkar was saying in his introduction, I need to know the person who's seeing the world and his delusions and projections and prejudices. So my last book, The Half-Known Life, was about North Korea and Iran and Kashmir and Sri Lanka, and mostly places of conflict and places of difficulty, the kind of places you're dealing with in the UN, because I need to know what's happening in the real world. And the sister book to it was about the monks who are living a life of absolute stillness. And so I'm always trying to do justice to both, keep myself moving around the world and root that movement in stillness, because I think the travel is only as rich as the stillness that underwrites it. But without both of them, I feel I would be not a complete human being.
So each complements the other.
Precisely.
You can't be accused of abandoning the world. of
I hope not.
escaping reality. No, I mean, it's fascinating because you have, of course, written a lot about the World Video Night in Kathmandu, Tropical Classical, the Global Soul, Sun After Dark, Flights into the Foreign, the Asiatics, Cuba and the Night. So all of these have been different ways of discovering different parts of the world, and Pico writes so uncommonly well. As you've heard, he speaks uncommonly well as well, so it's always a joy to read him. I haven't yet read him on stillness, I have to confess, and I'm very curious about that, but I thought you would whet my appetite for it, and you have. Thank you. But if I can turn you from that into something you briefly mentioned on side. You said that the 1990 fire taught you, in some ways, much about having a life with very little. I mean, you restarted life with a toothbrush and a bare floor to sleep on. Did you find yourself becoming more minimalist in your demands out of life as a result of that? Have you consciously eschewed material possessions, for example? Have you felt that you can get by with less, and is that therefore something you'd recommend to others? Or on the contrary, was it a moment of privation that you were only happy to overcome, and have you accumulated all the detritus of 21st century life, your mobile phones and laptops and iPads and cars and God knows what else, that are in some ways the accompaniments to the simple process of being alive today?
Yes, and just before I answer that, thank you for reading me so thoughtfully and listening to me so sensitively. And I think you are probably guilty also of living in the world of stillness and movement, because your novels are works of imagination that clearly come from sitting still, and then so much of your nonfiction and your life as a politician is right in the real world. But yes, so after my book Aflame came out last month, I found myself giving readings in the heart of devastated Los Angeles to people who just lost everything in the world, as I did many years ago. And I heard myself saying that that particular evening, most of what I saw was the loss. And as the months and years went on, I saw indeed, as your question suggests, that it could be a liberation, and I could gain something. So when the insurance company came along and offered to replace my goods, I realized I didn't need 90% of the books and furniture and clothes I'd accumulated. Just as you say, I could live much more minimally as I'd always wanted to. And because I lost all those notes for my next 3 nonfiction books, I thought, I've got to write from memory and imagination and heart, which are actually much deeper places than the notes, as you know. And so I tried writing fiction, which I'm sure I would have been too scared to attempt otherwise. And lacking a physical home in California, I started moving towards Japan, which of course is the spiritual home of minimalism and freedom from clutter and the empty tatami room. And I think there's a wisdom in the Japanese aesthetic whereby you go into a room, there's nothing there but a scroll and a vase. And because there are only 2 things there, you bring all your attention to them and you see the whole universe in that vase and the scroll, is the idea, at least. So I think losing so much in the fire did help me realize what I cherished. I thought a lot about it during the pandemic, when all of us were taking this enforced retreat. And I think many of us suddenly began to notice what we really care about. Our friends, our family, what is the most essential thing? It actually sifted the trivial from the essential very much. And the other curious thing is that I mentioned buying the toothbrush and going to sleep on my friend's floor, but because in those long ago days, my job was to be a columnist for Time magazine. Before I went to sleep the night of the fire, I went to write a piece for Time magazine. I used to write the back page essay. And I described the day that had just transpired, because I'd had this eyewitness view on a major news event. And because I'd been spending time in Japan already, I ended it with a poem that I'd found from the 17th century. Not well known then, but now I think quite familiar to some, from a guy called Masahide. It's a haiku, and he wrote, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." So the very night when I lost everything in the world, at 33 years old, something in me that was wiser than I realized it wasn't only a bad thing, and that actually it would sharpen my sense of priorities. And I'd always told myself, home isn't where you live, it's what lives inside you. And of course, the night of the fire, I realized yes, because I still had my mother, I still had my wife-to-be, I still had the songs that go through my head, I still had my favorite books. I'd lost everything material, but I still had a lot of things that were essential, if that's an answer.
Fascinating, yes, absolutely. Yes, I think you can see the reaction of people here. The theme of this overall ABP network's ideas of India is humanity's next frontier. And obviously AI is a very large part of that frontier. In many ways, what you've been reflecting on is sort of parallel to the questions that AI has been raising about what exactly it means to be human. If AI can now write a love poem to your girlfriend, as teenagers are discovering it can do, what is it that makes you human and different from AI? Obviously AI can't feel what it's writing. It's merely learned these words and knows they're appropriate to write on Valentine's Day or whatever. What does it mean to be human? And how do we find out what our humanity is in this age of AI, which is only on the ground floor? My God, the possibilities of what AI can and will be doing for us and to us are infinite, right? So we can only begin to grasp how it's going to change our lives. What about us? Who are we? I mean...
Of course, I'm in no position to tell us who we are, but I think the answer to your question is everything intangible and essential. What Mr. Sarkar said in his introductory remarks, it's the thing that AI can't give us is a sense of how to make wise and discerning use of AI. And for that, we have to go within. AI couldn't, I think, conduct this conversation between the two of us, couldn't speak for you or for me entirely. I think the question I ask myself, and the reason that I keep going to that hermitage, is what do you have to bring to the ICU, to the intensive care unit? Because at some time in life, probably both of us and many of the people we care for are going to end up there. And when I go, and not long ago, I suddenly got a phone call that my mother had had a stroke and she was teetering between life and death for 35 days, and I was in the ICU with her. And I thought, actually, my bank account is of limited use here. All the books I've written are beside the point. My resume is useless. The only thing I can bring to her and bring to myself in this difficult moment is whatever resources I've gathered within, which for me have probably come sitting in one place in silence. And I'm not sure that AI would have those resources or would be able to bring to my mother, as she's teetering in that state, the things that she most needs. It's interesting, I was at Dartmouth College a few weeks ago, and I was having lunch with a group of very intelligent graduate students. And one of them was a young Brazilian who loves reading. He's probably read all your books and some of mine. He feasts on literature and serious nonfiction. But his field was AI. So at the end of it, I asked him exactly the question you just asked me. And he just read one of my books and he'd enjoyed it. And I said, could AI write that book? He said, oh yeah, it'll write it much better than you did within 7 or 8 years. There were 3 women around the table, one of them from Mumbai, and they said, well, what about compassion? What about soul? What about humanity?
That's right.
Yeah, and obviously my prejudice was with the ladies, so I have to listen to what this expert in AI had told me. So there are many in this room who would know more than I about AI and its capabilities. But I think everything that distinguishes us as humans is by definition what AI can't replicate. I don't know, what do you think?
You know, I think that's a very good way of putting it, that everything that distinguishes us as human is what AI can't represent. But is it, number one, entirely accurate? Because already AI can represent, in the sense that a mirror can reflect who you are. It can't reflect what you're thinking, what you're feeling, but certainly you stand in front of it and it shows you everything about that you're Pico Iyer, that you look like this, what you're wearing, how your nose is shaped. Do you know what I'm saying? Okay. And so, for all practical purposes, if that's the appropriate phrase, it can depict and reflect and represent to that degree Pico Iyer. Now, what can it not do? Now, we believe it can't think like you, but perhaps your Brazilian friend will disagree, because if you run every single word you've ever written, every book, every column, through a sophisticated enough AI program, maybe it can turn out a Pico Iyer book that looks as if you've thought of it. I don't know. I mean, it's entirely possible from what little I'm hearing. And in that case, what makes you different? Maybe AI is inventing emotions it hasn't, quote unquote, felt, whereas you're writing about feelings that you've actually experienced. But can a reader tell the difference? It's an alarming thought, Pico. I don't know what your answer would be.
Yes, I mean, I haven't thought about it much myself before, but my sense is unexpectedness is something it can't do so well. Surprise. So people have sent me, they've asked AI, write such and such in the style of Pico Iyer, and I'm sure you've had the same.
Oh,
and
yeah.
it does a very good result. But 2 years ago, I brought out a book about traveling around the world. And so AI would take that and start writing about Iran and North Korea, which has nothing to do with my book about sitting still with the monks for 34 years. So as long as we keep surprising ourselves, we're always going to be ahead of AI, my sense is, because it's working with the Pico Iyer that already exists online. And the hope is that Pico Iyer, who's alive this moment,
is going beyond what Pico Iyer did.
Precisely.
No,
if nothing else, is doing something. I'm doing something different this morning than I'd ever done yesterday. So
that's our hope, is in our originality, in our authenticity.
Maybe.
Now, you still continue to divide your life between Japan and America, or is it Japan and the rest of the world?
More happily Japan and the rest of the world. And left to my own devices, I probably spent every day of my life in Japan. And I was thinking about how Japan is an interesting complement to India, as you know, I'm sure, because on the very different on the surface in the terms it's so orderly, it's so shy, it's so regimented. But deep down, in terms of sort of traditional values, respect for elders, sense of community, it's the Buddhist philosophy it took essentially from India. I think it has a lot in common, more in common with India than Europe might. So to put it another way, when I married a Japanese woman, my Indian mother was relieved because she thought it's not so different from having an Indian daughter-in-law. Whereas if she had had a Swedish or American, she might have thought, well, this daughter-in-law is not going to know what to do with me. And the other interesting thing about Japan, as probably everyone here knows, is going through this huge tourist boom at the moment. You can barely walk along the narrow streets of Kyoto at times. So many people, many of them from India, are there. 90 million people visited Kyoto last year. Many of them domestic, but also the number of foreign tourists has gone up 15-fold in the last 22 years. And the reason for that, as most of you know, because I'm sure people here have been to Japan, is that it's not like anywhere else. It's like another planet.
It is. And certainly as an Indian, I felt that very keenly. In every respect. I mean, you know, taxi drivers wearing white gloves, people standing at the subways to prise open the doors and push you in. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And of course, the cleanliness of the place is mind-boggling to the Indian sensibility. But I'm curious about this new cultural revival in the West about Japan. I mean, I remember reading the book Shogun 50 years ago when it came out. Apparently, it's now an absolutely hugely successful television series on OTT. Then Wim Wenders has made a movie about a Japanese toilet cleaner, and it's a huge success.
Yes.
Have you watched these? Have you seen them? Do they represent some sort of Japan that exists in the real life that you know so well?
Wonderfully. Unfortunately, I got sent a link to the Wim Wenders movie Perfect Days right after the main actor Koji Yakusho won the Best Actor award at Cannes. So my wife and I watched it twice in 5 days, and we were reduced to tears both times. Because it seemed the deepest, most meditative, subtlest movie we'd seen in a long, long time. And actually it speaks to exactly what we were talking about earlier, because it's so quiet and nothing happens, and it's about a person who's made a kind of perfect, quiet, simple, restrained life. And then I got to spend 3 days with the star and Wim Wenders at the Telluride Film Festival, interviewing them on stage and off stage. And I was so delighted first that a German man could make a film that, had I not known better, I would be sure was made by a Japanese.
Wow.
And the main actor, Mr. Yakusho, was so shy and self-effacing and quiet on stage that he incarnated, I think, some of the beautiful qualities in Japan. And I was going to say that the fact that Japan is a different planet has really hurt it geopolitically, because it's not on the same wavelength as the rest of the world, even the way China and South Korea are. But culturally, it's its great blessing, and that's why everyone wants to go to Japan, because it's not like anywhere else. And I think in some ways, to answer the end of your question, one thing that Japan and India share, to my mind, is that they take in everything from the rest of the world and all the latest developments and remain deeply themselves in the midst of that. And so my image of Japan is an old man in a Planet Hollywood t-shirt. In other words, he's up to the minute, he's cool, he's got all the global stuff, but he's still old and he's still Japanese. And when I go to, let's say, Varanasi, I see McDonald's outlets and Starbucks and shopping malls, but I feel at heart it's still the old Varanasi. And that neither of these countries, I hope, is going to become something entirely different. Their roots are very deep in India and Japan, I feel.
Well, that is the world in many ways, isn't it? I mean, I remember, since we've just been through the Kumbh Mela, still going through it, I remember an image from a previous Kumbh Mela of this naked sadhu, right out of Hollywood Central Casting, you know, Rudrakshamala around his neck, completely bare torso, matted hair, scraggly beard, you know, what's on his face, just completely staring away into the distance, this classic picture of timeless otherworldliness. And while he was staring away, he was chatting into a mobile phone. I wanted to use that as the cover image for my book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, but my publishers tell me, oh, it's too much of a cliche, they wouldn't agree. But it is also part of the same thing, this living in two centuries at once, just as you live in the world of travel and the world of stillness at the same time, Pico. I'm afraid we're out of time. Do we have an extension, folks, or do I have to wrap up? I have to wrap up. Well, let me thank Pico Iyer for this delightful excursion, incursion, whatever, into himself, into our lives, into the world of the 21st century. His book in India, the book is called Aflame Abroad, and here it's called In Search of Stillness, right?
Learning from Silence, yes. Learning from Silence.
Learning from Silence is the Indian edition. I recommend it strongly, simply because though I haven't yet read it, and I will, I like everything Pico writes. Pico Iyer, ladies and gentlemen, give him a hand.
And thank you. It's such an honor to share a stage with you.
Thank you both, gentlemen. I'm sure the audience agrees with me when I say we could have listened to you and not want silence on the stage for another couple of hours. Thank you so much for that engaging conversation. Please do remain on stage as I invite Dhruva Mukherjee, Director, ABP Network, and Mayank Agarwal, MD, Gallant Group of Industries, to present Mr. Iyer with a token of our gratitude. What a wonderful conversation, with many takeaways for all of us, how we can choose just a bit of silence in our everyday busy lives to find the purpose, to find the stillness within. Thank you very much to our presenters. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, and thank you very much, Mr. Iyer. And the wonderful thing about Ideas of India, ladies and gentlemen, is that just as we were talking about technology, how it can sometimes disrupt calm, what we can do in terms of finding our stillness and finding our calm in the midst of all that technology, we will now talk about how technology is truly changing our lives. This edition is, of course, about humanity's next frontier, and the one force changing it completely is artificial intelligence. It's not a tool, it's a revolution. It's